Part 3. The Silicon Valley Genesis, from Zip2 to the PayPal Mafia, 1995 to 2002. Chapter 21. Zip2. The First Exit and Corporate Friction. The office smelled like burned coffee and ambition. Two scents that in the autumn of 1995 were indistinguishable from each other along the bleached corridors of Palo Alto's startup corridors. Elon Musk was 24 years old. Sleeping on a futon, he had wedged into the back room of a small rented office on University Avenue, showering at the YMCA down the street, and spending the better part of every waking hour, 14, 16, sometimes 18 of them, staring at lines of code on a monitor that flickered faintly whenever a truck rolled past on the street outside. He had not yet become a myth. He was simply a young man with a Canadian-South African accent, an almost aggressive certainty, and the specific, unnerving quality of someone who believed, not hoped, not suspected, but genuinely believed, that what he was building mattered in a way that the people around him had not yet understood. He did not look the part of a revolutionary. He was broad-shouldered and slightly rumpled, given to wearing clothes that appeared to have been selected for function rather than impression. When he spoke in those early months, it was in long looping sentences that moved between technical specifications and grand civilizational claims with a fluency that unnerved investors who were accustomed to founders who knew to speak in one register at a time. The idea he was selling was called Zip2, a platform that would allow newspapers and local businesses to publish digital city guides, maps, and directories online. It was not, on its surface, a world-altering idea, but Musk had positioned it inside a story that was. The World Wide Web, in the fall of 1995, was barely a year old as a public phenomenon. Netscape had conducted its initial public offering in August of that year, and the response had been the financial equivalent of a thunderclap. Shares priced at $28 had opened at $71, and a generation of engineers, entrepreneurs, and venture capitalists had felt the ground shift beneath them. This was not merely a new industry. It was a reordering. Those who had been present at the beginning of other technological ruptures, the railroad boom, the electrification of American cities, the emergence of the automobile, had spoken in the language of destiny. And now, in the coffee shops and conference rooms of the San Francisco Bay Area, that language was being spoken again. Everyone with a modem and a vision was arriving, and the ones who arrived earliest and moved fastest, the gospel held, would inherit whatever came next. Musk had arrived from Stanford technically. He had enrolled in a PhD program in energy physics before withdrawing after 2 days, a detail he would later describe with a kind of cheerful ruthlessness, as though the decision had been so obvious it barely warranted explanation. With his brother Kimball, who had followed him from Canada with equal measures of enthusiasm and pragmatism, and a University of Toronto classmate named Greg Curry, he had incorporated a company called Global Link Information Network, which would soon be renamed Zip2. The name was catchier. The idea was functional. The execution, from the first weeks, was ferocious. What distinguished Musk from a great many of his contemporaries in those early months was not his technical skill, though that was genuine. It was his relationship to sleep, to leisure, and to the concept of sufficiency. Other founders worked hard. Musk worked as though the alternative was not merely failure, but something closer to moral dereliction. Kimball, who shared the cramped office space and watched his brother operate at close range during this period, would later describe the experience with a kind of awed bewilderment. The way Elon seemed constitutionally incapable of separating himself from whatever problem was directly in front of him. The code had to be better. The pitch had to be sharper. The product demo had to work. These were not aspirations. They were obligations. The friction, when it came, arrived through the front door in suits. By 1996, Zip2 had secured venture capital backing from Moore Davidow Ventures, a respected Sand Hill Road firm, to the tune of $3 million. It was a validation, necessary, welcome, and, as Musk would come to understand, double-edged. Venture capital was not merely money. It was leverage, and leverage traveled with opinions. The investors who had written the checks believed, with the reasonable confidence of people who had built companies before, that Musk's instincts, however brilliant, required professional containment. He was a technologist, they argued, not an operator. He needed management above him, experienced executives who could translate his vision into process, his urgency into organization. Musk resisted this characterization with everything he had, and his resistance was not merely ego, though there was ego. It was rooted in a theory of how companies should be led that he had formed from first principles, and which he would spend the next 3 decades refining and reimposing at every organization he built or controlled. The theory was simple, and depending on one's vantage point, either clarifying or terrifying. The person at the top must be the one who understands the product most deeply. Management that is separated from engineering by a layer of professional abstraction will always make decisions that are locally rational and globally wrong. The suits in Musk's cosmology were not merely useless, they were actively dangerous. The board did not share this view. In 1996, over Musk's explicit objection, they brought in a professional CEO named Rich Sorkin. It was presented as a promotion for Elon. He would serve as Chief Technology Officer, freed now to focus on what he did best. It was experienced in practice as something closer to a demotion. Musk did not hide his contempt for the arrangement. Those who worked at Zip2 during this period recall a palpable tension between the founder's desk and the executive suite, a constant low-grade current of disagreement about strategy, priorities, and pace. Musk would propose directions. The new management would deliberate, modify, or table them. Deliberation to Musk was delay, and delay was damage. There is an anecdote from this period that those who were present tend to tell in different ways, with different details sharpened depending on the teller's loyalties, but which converges around a consistent core. Musk, frustrated with what he perceived as the lumbering caution of the professional management layer, had taken to rewriting sections of Zip2's code himself, not assigning the work, not reviewing the work, but sitting down and doing it. There was something almost compulsive about it. The company had engineers. The work was being handled. But handled to Musk was not the same as handled correctly, and when he believed something was not being done correctly, his response was not to convene a meeting. It was to fix it himself, at whatever hour the impulse struck him, with the focused intensity of a man who considered the distance between a thought and its execution to be a kind of moral emergency. This was not, as some of his critics suggested at the time, mere arrogance. It was something more complex, and arguably more difficult to manage, a perfectionism so total that it had no off switch, no mechanism by which the ordinary human recognition of good enough could interrupt it. The board saw a founder who didn't know how to let go. Musk saw a board that didn't understand what letting go would cost. Both were, within their own frameworks, correct. The relationship that most clearly illuminates Musk's character during this window is not the one with the board, which was adversarial and clarifying in obvious ways. It is the one with his brother. Kimball Musk occupied a peculiar position in the Zip2 story, present from the founding, involved in business development, and possessed of a temperament that was in almost every important way the inverse of his brother's. Where Elon was consuming, Kimball was social. Where Elon processed the world through technical abstraction, Kimball processed it through people. He was, by multiple accounts, the company's unofficial ambassador to its own humanity, the one who remembered birthdays, who noticed when an employee was struggling, who understood that the people building the product were not simply components in a machine. The two brothers had grown up together in Pretoria, under a household that had not been warm in the conventional sense, shaped by a father whose emotional register was demanding and cold, and the experience had produced in each of them a different scar tissue. For Elon, it seemed to have calcified into an almost bottomless need to build, to justify existence through production. For Kimball, it had generated an intense appetite for connection, for the warmth that had been in short supply earlier. In the years at Zip2, this difference was less a source of conflict than a kind of complementary functioning. Kimball covered what Elon couldn't or wouldn't: the relational labor, the morale maintenance, the social diplomacy, while Elon drove the product forward with an engine that required no reciprocal warmth to keep running. It was a partnership built on asymmetry, and it worked within the limits of what Zip2 was able to become. It would continue to work, in different configurations, through nearly every major venture that followed. But its terms were always Elon's terms. The engine in every enterprise they shared was him. By 1998, Zip2 had grown into something genuinely significant. The company had signed content and mapping deals with more than 100 newspapers, including the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune, providing them with digital city guides, driving directions, and local business listings. This was not a trivial achievement. It required not only working technology, but sustained sales operations, real customer relationships, and the ability to integrate with legacy publishing infrastructure that had been designed in an era when the internet was someone else's problem. Zip2 had done it. The valuation had grown. The name within industry circles carried weight. And yet Musk remained in a state of low-grade institutional conflict, convinced that the company was moving slower than it should, that decisions being made by the professional management layer were sacrificing strategic clarity for organizational comfort. He had wanted Zip2 to become a consumer-facing brand, a destination in the vernacular of the moment, rather than a behind-the-scenes infrastructure provider for newspapers. The board had directed the company toward the latter model, because the latter model had revenue, and the former model had uncertainty. It was a rational decision. Musk believed it was a failure of nerve. The exit, when it came, arrived quickly and without the drama that the preceding years might have suggested. In February of 1999, Compaq Computer Corporation, then among the largest personal computer manufacturers in the world, and possessed of a specific anxiety about its own relevance in an internet-defined future, acquired Zip2 for $307 million in cash. It was, by the metrics of a 4-year-old company built with borrowed money and futon-adjacent sleeping arrangements, an extraordinary outcome. Musk's 7% stake converted to approximately $22 million. He was 27 years old. He did not celebrate in any way that people around him seemed to expect. Those who knew him during this period describe a mood that was less triumphant than forward-leaning, as if the acquisition were a problem that had been resolved and his attention had already moved to whatever came next. The money was noted. The vindication, such as it was registered. And then, with a speed that struck observers as almost unseemly, his focus had already migrated. He had begun, even before the deal closed, to think about banks. But the thing that lingered, the thing that would prove more durable than the money or the contacts or the engineering experience, was a lesson about governance that Musk filed away with the care of someone who has been burned by a specific flame and intends never to stand near it again. He had built something real and watched professionals tell him how to scale it. He had offered a strategic direction and been overruled by people who, in his estimation, had optimized for safety over significance. He had learned, in the most concrete possible terms, what it cost to be the founder who did not control the board, and he had resolved in whatever ventures came next to never occupy that position again. $22 million was, by the standards of 1999, and certainly by the standards of a man who had recently been showering at the YMCA, an almost incomprehensible sum. But Musk treated it less like a destination than like fuel, the first significant charge in a series of bets he was already calculating, the stakes of which would make Zip2 look, in retrospect, like a rehearsal for something far stranger and far larger than anything he had yet allowed himself to say aloud. The bank he was about to build would carry his ambitions further than any newspaper directory ever could, and the collision he was about to engineer, between his vision, other people's money, and his own stubborn refusal to share control, would produce consequences that no one in that Palo Alto office, not even Musk himself, had fully reckoned with yet. Chapter 22. The Birth of X.com, Reimagining Finance. The check cleared on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday Elon Musk was already spending it. Not on a house, though he would eventually acquire one, a modest place in Palo Alto that he approached with the same utilitarian logic he applied to most things that were not the work itself. Not on a car, not on a vacation, not on any of the ordinary luxuries that 27-year-olds who had just deposited $22 million into their bank accounts tend to reach for first, as though the money were a permission slip for the life they had been postponing. Musk reached for none of that. He reached instead for a problem. The problem was banks. He had been thinking about them for years, not as institutions to be patronized, but as institutions to be understood, and having understood them, to be replaced. He would sit with people in those early months of 1999 and describe the American financial system the way an engineer describes a bridge that was built badly and has been held together since by habit, and the reluctance of the people who depend on it to admit how close it is to failing. The banks had the data, had the trust, had the regulatory infrastructure, had a century of accumulated inertia working in their favor, and yet, Musk argued, they were doing almost nothing with any of it. They were slow. They were expensive. They were organized around their own convenience rather than their customers. They charged fees the way a toll booth charges a driver, not because the service warranted the price, but because the driver had no other road. He found this in the specific way that he found most forms of inefficiency, not merely frustrating but faintly offensive. $12 million of his Zip2 proceeds, more than half of what he had cleared, went directly into a new company. He called it X.com. The name was a provocation as much as a brand. In 1999, the single-letter .com domain was a kind of digital real estate that occupied the highest tier of the imaginable, and Musk had paid handsomely to acquire it, a decision that struck more than a few observers as a vanity play for a company that had not yet written its first line of production code. But the name was doing something else too, something that would not become fully legible until much later, when Musk would return to it again and again across the decades, as though it represented something he had never quite finished saying. X was the variable. X was the unknown that contained everything. X was not a product name, it was a declaration of scope. The scope, as he described it to early employees and potential investors in the spring and summer of 1999, was total. X.com would not be an online bank in the way that people were then beginning to imagine online banks, a digital interface layered over the same slow, fee-laden plumbing that existed in brick-and-mortar branches. It would be something categorically different, a single financial platform on which a customer could hold checking and savings accounts, purchase insurance, make investments, send money anywhere in the world, and eventually conduct every financial transaction their life required without ever touching a traditional institution. The everything app for money, 2 decades before the phrase existed. A financial operating system for the individual. The world into which Musk launched X.com was, in the most precise sense, the best and worst possible world for such an idea. The best because the year 1999 was operating at a frequency of collective delusion that, in retrospect, resembles nothing so much as a fever. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had crossed 10,000 for the first time in history in March. Internet companies were going public on the strength of PowerPoint decks, and the credulous enthusiasm of investors who had decided, with the confident illogic of people in the grip of a mania, that the old rules no longer applied. Eyeballs had become a unit of valuation. Burn rate had become a term of art, deployed not with alarm, but with a kind of pride, as though spending money faster than you made it was evidence of seriousness rather than recklessness. The capital was abundant. The appetite for disruption was voracious. The worst because banking was not a social network or a search engine or an online bookstore. It was one of the most heavily regulated industries in the United States, a sector whose legal architecture had been constructed over the better part of a century in deliberate response to catastrophic failures. The bank runs of the 1930s, the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, the accumulated hard lessons of a financial system that had collapsed before and carried the scar tissue to prove it. To build what Musk was describing required not only engineering but licenses, banking licenses, insurance licenses, securities licenses, a gauntlet of regulatory approvals that had been specifically designed to make what he was proposing difficult, slow, and expensive. Musk hired lawyers, hired compliance officers, and moved forward. The core conflict at X.com in its earliest phase was not regulatory, however, though regulation would generate its share of friction. It was philosophical, and it lived inside the question that every person Musk hired eventually had to answer for themselves. Did they believe, with the specific and unconditional conviction that the work required, that the financial system could be rebuilt from scratch by a team of engineers working out of a Palo Alto office? Most people, when pressed, discovered that they believed something more modest, that incremental improvements were possible, that a better digital interface for existing banking infrastructure was achievable, that the goal should be a good product rather than a remade world. Musk did not believe this. He believed the modest version was the wrong target, that aiming at it was a form of failure dressed as pragmatism, and that anyone who worked for him needed to share his view of the horizon or they would become, over time, a drag on the velocity of everyone else. This was not a management philosophy that made him easy to work for. It was a management philosophy that made him, for the specific type of person who shared his pathology, impossible to work anywhere else. The hiring in those early months reflected his priorities with a kind of archaeological clarity. He wanted engineers who were not merely skilled but obsessive, people for whom the problem was genuinely consuming rather than merely interesting. He wanted people who treated the 60-hour week as a floor rather than a ceiling. He offered equity generously and salary modestly, a ratio that served as a filter. Those who needed the salary tended not to stay, and those who stayed tended to be the ones whose internal calculus weighted the possibility of transformative outcome over the certainty of comfortable compensation. The office culture that emerged from these selections was intense, in the way that startup culture often claims to be intense, and only occasionally actually is. A place where the lights were frequently on at 2 a.m, where the debates about product direction were conducted at a volume and a conviction that could unnerve visitors, and where the sense of historical momentum was kept at a constant simmer by the man whose name was on the company's domain. There is a moment from the summer of 1999 that several early X.com employees have recounted in different forms to journalists and biographers over the years. Musk was presenting the product roadmap to the team, not a polished investor deck but a working document dense with features and timelines and dependencies. And someone, a new engineer who had not yet calibrated the room, raised his hand and asked whether the timeline was realistic. The full banking and insurance platform, with international transfer capabilities, in 18 months. Had Musk accounted for the regulatory delays, the API integrations, the consumer trust problem that any new financial institution would need to overcome? Musk looked at him for a moment with the expression that those who have worked with him describe consistently enough, that it has acquired a kind of legendary status, not contemptuous exactly, but evaluative in a way that is almost clinical, as though the asker has revealed something about themselves that is being filed away. The timeline is what it needs to be, Musk said, not what's comfortable. The engineer's question was not wrong. The timeline was, in fact, aggressive to the point of impossibility by most conventional assessments. But Musk's answer was not an evasion of the question. It was a genuine statement of his operating principle, a philosophy he had developed not in business school, which he had never attended, but from a reading of history that had persuaded him that the constraints most people treat as fixed are, in the majority of cases, negotiable. Schedule, like most things, was a function of will and resources. The question was not whether the timeline was comfortable. The question was whether the work could be organized to meet it. These were different questions, and he found the conflation of them maddening. The figure who most clearly shaped the texture of X.com's early culture, and who represents the pivotal relationship of this particular chapter, was not a co-founder or a board member. It was Harris Fricker, one of the first senior hires, a Canadian finance professional whom Musk brought on as a co-founder and early president of the company. Fricker was polished in a way that Musk was not, possessed of the kind of institutional credibility that came from years inside traditional finance, and he had been recruited in part because Musk recognized, with characteristic unsentimental clarity, that the company would need someone who could speak the language of banks and regulators without triggering their reflexive suspicion of Silicon Valley. The relationship worked for a time, the way many of Musk's early partnerships worked, through the productive tension of two people who needed each other for different things and were willing to tolerate the friction that need created. Fricker understood financial systems. Musk understood product. Fricker could navigate regulators. Musk could recruit engineers. But underneath the functional complementarity ran a seam of incompatibility that would not remain buried indefinitely. Fricker believed in the considered decision, in the building of consensus, in the value of institutional knowledge, and the wisdom of moving at a pace that the industry being disrupted could process. Musk believed in speed as a strategic weapon, that the company which moved fastest controlled the terms of every engagement that followed. These were not merely different temperaments. They were different theories of what the company was for. By the end of 1999, the seam had begun to show. The disagreements over product direction, which features to prioritize, how aggressively to market to consumers before the platform was fully built, how much regulatory risk was acceptable in pursuit of velocity, had moved from the category of productive debate into something that had the quality of structural tension. Those who were present described meetings that ended not in resolution, but in a kind of suspended disagreement, Decisions deferred until the next conversation, the next week, the next crisis that would force the issue. Musk's tolerance for this dynamic was not infinite, and those who knew him understood that a man with a non-infinite tolerance for deferred decisions and $12 million of his own money in the company was not a man who would defer indefinitely. Outside the walls of X.com's office, the world of 1999 was accelerating toward a crisis that almost no one was yet calling a crisis. The Nasdaq was climbing. The money was still moving. The faith in digital transformation was, if anything, intensifying, fed by every successful IPO and every magazine cover featuring a 20-something founder in a gray t-shirt. The party had not yet developed any of the visible signs of ending, and in the context of that party, a company trying to rebuild the global financial system from a Palo Alto office seemed not merely plausible but appropriately ambitious. But Musk was beginning to hear from the edges of his own network about another company, a small payments startup founded a year earlier by a pair of Stanford and University of Illinois graduates that had developed an elegant, frictionless mechanism for sending money via email. It was not trying to rebuild the entire financial system. It was solving one specific problem and solving it beautifully. Its name was Confinity. The elegance of what Confinity had built was, for Musk, a complicated thing to contemplate. He recognized quality when he encountered it. He had always been too rigorous an engineer to dismiss good work simply because it came from a competitor. But he also understood, with the pattern recognition of someone who had been watching the internet economy consolidate for 5 years, that two companies trying to occupy the same space in the payments market were not a stable configuration. The money was real. The customers were real. The collision, if it came, would be real. What he had not yet understood, what no one in the X.com offices could have fully understood, as 1999 turned toward 2000, was that the man he was about to face across the negotiating table would prove to be the most consequential adversary, ally, and mirror of his entire career, and that the merger they would soon be forced to contemplate would set in motion a power struggle whose outcome would shape not just two companies, but the entire trajectory of everything Musk would attempt for the next quarter century. Chapter 23. The Confinity Merger and the Rise of PayPal. The term sheet was 12 pages long, and Musk had read it 4 times before the meeting began. He sat at the head of a conference table in early March of 2000, in a room that had the particular quality of Silicon Valley conference rooms during the dot-com boom. Aggressively neutral, furnished with the ergonomic chairs and whiteboards and catered lunch spreads that served as the universal signifiers of a certain kind of ambition, and he was still. Not relaxed, not comfortable, but still in the way that a compression spring is still, loaded, waiting, storing energy against the moment of release. Across the table, in various configurations of studied casualness, sat the representatives of Confinity, a company that had been, for the better part of the previous 12 months, his most direct competitor and his most instructive irritant. Peter Thiel was among them. Angular and deliberate, with the quality of someone who processed the world primarily as a series of logical propositions, and had learned, over time, to perform the social scaffolding that logic requires but does not naturally produce. Max Levchin was there too, younger, more visibly energized, carrying the specific alertness of an engineer who is most comfortable when the conversation is about something he has built. Musk looked at the term sheet again. Then he looked across the table. The merger that was being negotiated in that room, and in the weeks of phone calls and document exchanges and boardroom arguments that preceded and followed it, was not, in the conventional sense, a friendly one. It was a survival arrangement disguised as a partnership, and everyone present understood this, which meant that everyone present was performing a version of confidence they did not entirely feel. X.com and Confinity had spent months in a customer acquisition war that had been ruinously expensive for both sides, each company offering sign-up bonuses and referral incentives that had succeeded in growing their respective user bases and hollowing out their respective balance sheets with approximately equal efficiency. The math, by early 2000, was becoming impossible to ignore. Two companies burning money at this rate, in a market that could ultimately support one dominant player, were not a competition. They were a mutual assured destruction scenario, with better branding. The world outside that conference room was doing something that almost no one inside it had fully absorbed yet. The Nasdaq Composite had peaked on March 10, 2000, the precise week the merger conversations were reaching their most critical phase, at just over 5,000 points, a number that represented, though it would take months for this to become undeniable, the exact high water mark of one of the most spectacular financial manias in American history. The tide had reached its furthest point and was beginning, invisibly at first, to recede. The companies that had been valued on the logic of infinite future growth were beginning to encounter the ordinary arithmetic of finite present cash, and the investors who had funded them on faith were beginning to ask questions they had not thought to ask when the market was still climbing. The party was ending. The lights were coming up, and the people still on the dance floor were only beginning to notice the change in the music. For Musk, who had built X.com on $12 million of his own money, and had spent the subsequent year watching that stake either compound magnificently or evaporate entirely depending on the week, the timing of the merger carried a specific urgency that the Confinity team, with their venture backing and their slightly more cushioned runway, did not feel with quite the same intensity. He needed this deal. He needed it to work. And he needed, as he needed everything, to control the terms on which it worked. The structure of the merger, as eventually agreed, was a stock-for-stock exchange that valued both companies at roughly equal amounts, a framing that both sides could present to their respective teams as a victory and that both sides understood privately to be a fiction. Musk would be named CEO of the combined entity. X.com would be the surviving corporate identity. These were the terms that mattered to him, and he had pressed for them with the focused persistence of someone who understood that the governance structure of a newly merged company was not an administrative formality. It was the architecture of who, when the disagreements came, and they would come, got to decide. The disagreements came almost immediately. The combined company inherited not merely two sets of engineers and two customer bases, but two fundamentally incompatible visions of what it was building. X.com's ambition, as Musk had articulated it from the first day, was total. The complete financial platform, the one-stop shop for every monetary interaction in a person's life, the replacement of the banking system rather than its decoration. Confinity's product, the email payment service that its engineers had built with an elegance that Musk had privately admitted was impressive, was narrower, more focused, and more immediately functional. Send money to anyone with an email address instantly without friction. It did one thing. It did that thing extraordinarily well. The question of which vision should govern the combined company became, within weeks of the merger closing, the defining conflict of Musk's tenure as CEO. He pushed relentlessly toward the broader platform, insisting that the email payment product, which users were calling PayPal, a name that had emerged from Confinity's marketing and that was sticking with the organic persistence of names that actually describe what they do, was a feature, not a destiny. He wanted to build the whole cathedral. The Confinity contingent, including Thiel, who had moved into a board role, and Levchin, who remained deeply involved in engineering, argued that they had a product people actually used and loved, and that the correct strategic decision was to pursue that product with complete focus rather than diluting it with the ambitions of a financial empire that did not yet exist. Musk overruled them. Repeatedly. With the specific confidence of a man who had read the same history books and arrived at different conclusions, he moved the company's technical resources toward the broader platform. He made product decisions unilaterally. He set priorities that the engineering team from Confinity found by varying degrees misguided or infuriating or both. The tension in the merged company's offices was of a different quality than the normal friction of integration. Not the ordinary discomfort of two cultures learning to coexist, but something sharper, more personal, more freighted with competing theories of what it meant to be right. There is a decision from the summer of 2000 that crystallizes this period with a precision that no amount of general description can match. Musk, in his role as CEO, had made the determination that the combined company's technical infrastructure should be migrated from the Unix-based system that Confinity's engineers had built to a Microsoft Windows-based architecture. It was, on its surface, a technical decision. In practice, it was a declaration of values, and the Confinity engineers understood it as such. Their system worked. It was stable, fast, and had been built by people who were deeply familiar with its architecture. The Microsoft migration would require months of engineering work, would introduce instability during the transition, and was, in their estimation, a solution to a problem that did not exist, imposed by a CEO who had a preference for Windows-based systems that preceded and outweighed the specific evidence in front of him. Levchin, who had built Confinity's infrastructure, and who possessed the specific passion of a craftsman toward work he has made carefully, opposed the migration with everything available to him. He argued the technical case. He presented the data. He convened the engineers and let their collective skepticism speak for itself. Musk listened to all of it and proceeded anyway. It was not that he had processed the arguments and found them wanting. It was that he had processed them and found his own judgment more compelling, a pattern so consistent across his career that it functions less as a character detail than as a structural feature of how he operates in the world. He was not incapable of being wrong. He was incapable of being argued out of something he had already decided was right. The migration was halted eventually by the combined pressure of engineering reality and market crisis, not by the persuasion of the people who had been arguing against it from the start. But the damage to the internal cohesion of the merged company had been done, and it was of a kind that does not repair itself simply because the offending decision is reversed. The figure who stands at the center of this chapter's relational architecture is Peter Thiel, and the relationship between Thiel and Musk during this period is one of the more instructive studies in how two genuinely exceptional minds, sharing a physical space and a corporate structure, can produce not collaboration but a Cold War. They were, in the specific ways that matter most, mirror images of each other's limitations. Musk was a force of forward motion, magnificent at generating momentum, and chronically resistant to the constraints that momentum creates. Thiel was a force of strategic discipline, possessed of a clarity about competitive positioning and organizational coherence that was, in its own way, as formidable as Musk's drive, and equally difficult to argue with. Both men were accustomed to being the most rigorous thinker in any room they entered. In the merged company's conference rooms, they were in the same room, and the experience produced not mutual enrichment but a sustained low-temperature conflict that was never quite open enough to resolve and never quite contained enough to ignore. Thiel had been removed from the CEO role at Confinity as part of the merger negotiations, a condition Musk had insisted on with the logic, not entirely cynical, that a merged company with two CEOs was not a company but a civil war waiting for a spark. Thiel had accepted the board role with the grace of someone who intends to return. He watched the technical migration controversy unfold. He watched the product prioritization battles. He watched the growing unrest among the Confinity engineers, several of whom were beginning to contemplate exits. And he began, with the methodical patience of a chess player who is willing to wait as many moves as the position requires, to build the case that what the company needed was a change in leadership. The summer of 2000 was the summer the internet economy began to understand what it had been doing for the previous 5 years. The Nasdaq had fallen 30% from its March peak. The venture capital firms that had been writing checks with the enthusiasm of people spending someone else's money, which, of course, was precisely what they were doing, had grown quiet and then quieter. The companies that had been valued on promise alone were beginning to encounter the reality that promise requires fuel, and the fuel was running out. In this environment, a merged payments company with internal warfare over its technical architecture and a CEO whose instincts tilted toward expansion rather than consolidation was not a company that inspired confidence. Musk was aware of the pressure. He was aware of the board's growing unease. He was aware, in the specific way that founders are aware of threats to their own positions, with the peripheral nervous system as much as the conscious mind, that something was moving in the organization beneath the surface of ordinary business. He moved faster. He pushed harder. He insisted, in the meetings where the direction of the company was debated, on the vision that had brought him here, the full financial platform, the everything app, the replacement of the existing system with something worthy of the moment. He was not wrong about the vision. He had never been wrong about the vision. That was not what was about to be used against him. In September of 2000, Musk boarded a plane to Australia with his wife Justine for what was to be a brief vacation, the first real rest he had permitted himself in months. He had earned it, by any reasonable measure. He had built 2 companies, merged them under impossible conditions, and navigated the opening months of a market collapse with his equity and his ambitions intact. The plane took off, and somewhere over the Pacific, the board of the company he had founded, the company that bore his chosen letter, the company into which he had poured $12 million and 2 years of total commitment, convened a meeting without him. What they decided in that meeting would strip him of the CEO title he had negotiated so carefully, install Peter Thiel in his place, and set in motion a chain of consequences that Musk would spend the rest of his life processing. Not with grief, exactly, but with the particular catalyzing fury of a man who has been told for the second time that the thing he built does not belong entirely to him, and who has decided, with the cold finality of a door closing, that he will never allow that to happen again. Chapter 24. The PayPal Coup, Leadership Struggles and Lessons. The phone call reached him somewhere over the Pacific, and the cabin around him continued its ordinary hum of recycled air and engine noise, indifferent to the fact that the world had just rearranged itself. Elon Musk was 29 years old, newly married, sitting beside Justine in the pressurized dark of a long-haul flight to Australia, and the voice on the other end of the line was telling him, in the careful language that people use when they are delivering information they know will produce a reaction they cannot fully predict, that the board of the company he had founded had met in his absence and voted to remove him as CEO. Peter Thiel would take the role. Musk would be offered an advisory position, a title that is, in the grammar of corporate politics, the precise equivalent of a consolation prize wrapped in the language of respect. He was still the largest single shareholder. He still had the equity. He still had the money, or would have it eventually, when the company reached the exit that everyone was still working toward. What he no longer had was control. He held the phone for a moment after the call ended. Those who know him well describe a quality he exhibits in moments of acute stress that is the inverse of what most people expect. Not explosion, not visible fury, but a kind of compressive stillness, as though the emotional force of the event is being absorbed inward rather than released outward, stored somewhere deep and pressurized, available for conversion into something else at a later date. Whether that is what happened in that specific moment, in that specific seat over that specific ocean, only Musk knows with certainty. What is certain is that by the time the plane landed, he had already begun the process of deciding what the information meant and what he intended to do with it. The marriage was 5 days old. To understand what the coup meant, not merely as a business event but as a psychological one, as a moment that would leave marks on every organizational decision Musk made for the following 2 decades, it is necessary to understand what the world looked like in September of 2000 and what it felt like to be inside it. The dot-com collapse was no longer a possibility or a premonition. It was a fact, sprawling and accelerating, visible in the NASDAQ charts that had been falling since March with the steady, remorseless gravity of something that had always been going to fall. The companies that had been described 18 months earlier as the infrastructure of the future were now being described, with the casual brutality of financial journalism, as cautionary tales. Pets.com had aired a Super Bowl commercial in January and would file for bankruptcy by November. Webvan, which had promised to reinvent grocery delivery, was burning through cash at a rate that would make its collapse, when it came the following year, one of the most expensive in the history of the venture industry. The faith that had underwritten all of it, the faith that the internet was not subject to the ordinary constraints of revenue and profitability and sustainable unit economics, was not eroding. It was evaporating. In this environment, the board of what was still officially called X.com was facing a specific and urgent version of the general problem. The company had a product, the PayPal email payment service, that users genuinely wanted and were using in growing numbers. It had a CEO, Musk, who was brilliant, committed, and in the board's collective estimation, wrong about several things that mattered enormously in a contracting market. The pivot toward the full financial platform, the Windows migration, the product prioritization battles that had produced months of internal conflict, and the quiet departure of engineers the company could not afford to lose, these were not, in isolation, fatal. Together, in a market that had stopped rewarding vision and started demanding survival, they constituted a case. The case had been built carefully, and it had been built primarily by 2 people, Peter Thiel and Max Levchin. Thiel had spent the months since the merger in the specific manner of someone who has been displaced from a position he considered rightfully his, and has decided that patience is the most effective weapon available. He had watched the technical decisions. He had monitored the engineering team's morale. He had kept his relationships with the Confinity veterans warm, and his criticisms of Musk's leadership measured enough to be credible rather than merely aggrieved. When he began, in the late summer of 2000, to have the conversations that would culminate in the board meeting, he was not operating from rage. He was operating from a theory that the company's survival required a different kind of leadership, one that would focus on the payment product rather than the financial empire, on consolidation rather than expansion, on the specific rather than the total. Levchin's role was different in texture, but equal in consequence. He was not a political operator in the way that Thiel was. He was an engineer with the engineer's particular form of moral seriousness, the conviction that bad technical decisions are not merely inefficient but wrong, in the same way that a badly designed bridge is not merely inconvenient but dangerous. The Windows migration had offended him at a level that was almost aesthetic. The prioritization battles had convinced him that Musk's leadership was incompatible with the survival of the thing they had built. His participation in the boardroom conversation was not, in his own understanding of it, a coup. It was a correction. The board voted. Musk was in the air. The advisory role they offered him was, in the specific dynamics of the situation, a careful calculation. Musk was the largest shareholder. He could not be made irrelevant, not entirely. His equity gave him a presence in the company's future that no organizational chart could erase. The advisory title was the board's attempt to manage the contradiction between needing his continued cooperation and having just demonstrated that they did not trust his judgment. It was the kind of compromise that satisfies no one completely, which is how most compromises in corporate governance are identified as such. Musk accepted the advisory role. He did not make a scene, did not threaten litigation, did not immediately liquidate his position in a gesture of wounded pride. What he did in the weeks and months that followed was something more revealing. He engaged. He attended the meetings he was invited to. He offered opinions when asked, and occasionally when not. He watched how Thiel ran the company. The strategic discipline, the focus, the willingness to make the narrowing choices that Musk had resisted. And he processed what he saw with the evaluative intensity of someone who is simultaneously absorbing a lesson and cataloging a grievance. There is a meeting from the winter of 2000, recalled by several people who were present, that functions as a kind of keyhole into the specific quality of Musk's mind during this period. He had been invited to an advisory session in which the newly restructured leadership team was presenting its plan for the company's next 12 months, a plan that centered, as Thiel had always argued it should, on the PayPal product, on user growth, on the path to profitability that a tightening market now made non-negotiable. The presentation was coherent, well argued, and built around exactly the focused logic that the Confinity team had been advocating for months. Musk listened to the entire presentation without interrupting, which was itself notable enough that people in the room remembered it. When it was finished, he asked a single question: what was the plan for international expansion? The question was not combative. It was genuine. And in its genuineness lay its complexity, because the question revealed that Musk had not, in the weeks since his removal, updated his underlying model of what the company should be. He was not, in that moment, being difficult. He was being himself, which is to say he was thinking at the scale of the whole system rather than the immediate problem, unable to fully suppress the vision even in the room where the vision had been voted down. The people who had replaced him heard the question as evidence that he still didn't understand. Musk heard their answer, which was, essentially, that international expansion was not the current priority, as evidence that they still didn't see far enough. Both were right. That was the problem. The relationship between Musk and Justine during this period deserves a careful accounting, because it was more than backdrop. It was the primary human context in which he processed what had happened and what it meant. Justine Wilson had met Musk at Queen's University in Ontario, where she was a student, and he was pursuing her with the same systematic persistence he brought to other problems he had decided to solve. She was a writer, not an engineer, not a technologist, not a person whose world was organized around product roadmaps and term sheets, and she brought to the relationship a form of intelligence that was entirely different from the kind Musk was surrounded by at work. She was perceptive about people. She was articulate about inner life. She understood, perhaps earlier than most, that the man she had married was not merely ambitious in the ordinary sense, but driven by something that operated beneath ambition, something older and less negotiable. The honeymoon had been interrupted before it properly began. The flight over the Pacific had delivered not rest, but the news that would define the next phase of his professional life. When they landed in Australia and moved through the ordinary motions of a vacation that had already been fundamentally altered by the phone call, Justine observed her husband with the attention that writers bring to the people they love, noticing what he did not say as much as what he said, watching how the event had settled into his body. He was not, she would later write and speak about this period, crushed. He was not broken. He was doing what he always did with things that hurt him, which was to convert them, through some internal process she could never quite fully map, into fuel. The specific fuel this event produced was a lesson so concrete and so thoroughly internalized that it would structure every significant decision Musk made about organizational governance for the rest of his life. The lesson was not complicated. It did not require a business school seminar or a management consultant to articulate. It was this: the person who controls the equity does not necessarily control the company. The person who controls the voting rights does. These are separable things, and the people who had removed him had understood their separability in ways that he, in the founding of X.com and the negotiation of the merger, had not adequately protected against. He had been the largest shareholder and had been removed anyway. The board had the votes. He had not. It would never happen that way again. This was not a vow made in dramatic terms. It was not announced or declared or even, perhaps, consciously formulated as a principle in the days immediately following the coup. It was something that sedimented into the bedrock of his operating philosophy slowly and completely, the way lessons learned from genuine pain tend to sediment, not as an idea to be revisited, but as a structural feature of how he would build every subsequent thing. At Tesla, he would fight for board control with a tenacity that frustrated investors and governance experts alike. At SpaceX, he would structure the company from the beginning to ensure that no coalition of disgruntled insiders could organize a similar outcome. At X, the social media company he would acquire decades later and rename with the same letter he had chosen in 1999, as though returning to complete something, he would buy the whole thing outright, eliminating the board problem entirely by becoming the board. The PayPal story did not end with his removal. The company, under Thiel's leadership, did precisely what Thiel had argued it should do. It focused, it grew, it became the dominant email payment platform in the world, and it was acquired by eBay in October of 2002 for $1.5 billion. Musk's stake, which he had retained through all of it, converted to approximately $180 million. It was, by any measure, a transformational outcome, the number that would fund SpaceX, fund his initial investment in Tesla, fund the next decade of ambitions that had been waiting, with the patience of things that are very large and very certain of themselves, for the capital that would make them possible. He had been ousted, and he had been made rich. He had lost the fight and won the exit. He had been told, for the second time in 3 years, that the thing he built did not belong entirely to him, and the lesson had arrived this time with a specificity and a force that the Zip2 experience, for all its frustrations, had not quite achieved. He was 29 years old. He had $180 million, a new wife, and a theory of governance that had been written in the language of personal humiliation, and was now as permanent a part of him as anything formed in childhood. The rockets he had been reading about since boyhood, the ones that had populated the science fiction that had shaped him, the ones that NASA had built and partially abandoned, the ones that represented, in his cosmology, the most important project the human species could undertake, were no longer merely an obsession. They were at last within reach, and the hunger with which he was about to pursue them would make everything that had come before, the startups, the mergers, the boardroom wars, look in retrospect like the education of a man who had been preparing, without quite knowing it, for something that the world had not yet been asked to take seriously. Chapter 25. The PayPal Mafia, a network of Silicon Valley influence. The check from eBay cleared in October of 2002, and the room where it metaphorically landed. The collective consciousness of the people who had built PayPal from a cramped Palo Alto office into a payments infrastructure that processed billions of dollars annually did not feel like a celebration so much as a detonation. Not a destructive one. The other kind. The kind that disperses material outward in all directions simultaneously, each fragment carrying the kinetic energy of the original mass, traveling fast and far and with a force that is only fully understood when you trace years later where everything landed. The PayPal acquisition was not merely a liquidity event. It was a dispersal mechanism, the moment at which a concentrated collection of exceptional, ambitious, capital flush, and mutually aware people were released from the organizational structure that had been containing them, and sent outward into the broader world with the resources and the confidence and the institutional memory of having built something significant together. What happened next was not accidental. It was the logical consequence of what those people were, applied now to a canvas that no longer had any particular edges. Elon Musk received approximately $180 million from the sale. He was 31 years old. He did not go to the closing dinner. This detail, small in isolation, is clarifying in context. The closing dinner was the symbolic endpoint of the PayPal chapter, the gathering where the principals toasted the exit and congratulated each other, and performed the rituals of collective achievement that marked the conclusion of a shared endeavor. Musk's absence was not, by most accounts, a dramatic gesture. He had already moved on, in the way that he always moved on from things that were finished, completely, immediately, without the sentimental lingering that the moment might have seemed to call for. He had already been thinking about rockets for months. The PayPal sale was, in his internal accounting, the release of fuel he needed for the next stage of ignition. The dinner was the past. The past was not where he was. The year 2002 was, in the technology industry, a year of aftermath. The dot-com collapse had completed the bulk of its destruction. The Nasdaq had fallen nearly 80% from its March 2000 peak, and the carnage it had left behind was visible in the empty office parks along Highway 101, in the subleased server rooms, in the biographical footnotes of a generation of founders whose companies had not survived long enough to tell a complete story. The venture capital industry had contracted. The press, which had spent 5 years generating hagiographies of 26-year-old CEOs, had pivoted with equal enthusiasm to requiems. The mood was not merely cautious. It was specifically, pointedly skeptical of the kind of transformative ambition that had animated the boom years. Skeptical, in the way that people who have been burned are skeptical of fire, with a visceral rather than merely intellectual distrust. Into this environment, the PayPal alumni dispersed with a collective disregard for the prevailing mood that would, within a decade, redefine the technology industry entirely. The group that journalists would eventually christen the PayPal Mafia. The name arrived courtesy of a 2007 Fortune magazine profile, and it stuck with the inevitability of names that are both slightly unflattering and completely accurate, was not, in any formal sense, an organization. There were no membership dues, no bylaws, no official structure. What existed instead was something more durable and more powerful. A shared vocabulary, a mutual credibility, and a network of relationships that had been stress-tested by the specific pressures of building a company together through a merger and a coup and a market collapse and an acquisition. These were not people who merely knew each other. They were people who had watched each other operate under conditions that strip away the performance of capability and reveal the actual thing. They trusted each other's judgment, or they had calibrated their distrust of it, which amounts to nearly the same thing in practical terms. Peter Thiel moved fastest and most deliberately. The philosophical architecture of what he did next had been visible in how he operated throughout the PayPal years. The interest in contrarian thinking, the conviction that the most valuable opportunities were the ones that the consensus had dismissed or failed to identify, the belief that the correct question was not how to compete in existing markets, but how to create new ones that you could dominate before anyone else understood they existed. He co-founded Palantir Technologies in 2003, a data analytics company oriented toward national security applications, a strange, ambitious, politically complex enterprise that made almost no concession to the conventional wisdom about what a technology startup should look like or whom it should serve. He launched Founders Fund, a venture capital firm whose stated philosophy was an explicit rebuke of the incremental. The firm's founding documents contained the line that would become its most quoted provocation, to the effect that investors had been promised flying cars and received instead 140 characters. The line was aimed at the technology industry's retreat from physical and scientific ambition into the safer, more profitable terrain of software and social media. The line was also, whether consciously or not, a description of Musk. Reid Hoffman, who had been PayPal's vice president of external affairs, and who possessed a quality of social and strategic intelligence that was different in kind from Thiel's philosophical rigor or Musk's engineering drive, more relational, more attuned to the network dynamics of how people and institutions connect, took his proceeds and his instincts to LinkedIn, which he founded in 2003. The idea was straightforward in its description and profound in its implications, a professional network that would function as the connective tissue of the global workforce. It was, in retrospect, an almost perfect expression of what Hoffman understood that his PayPal colleagues did not always prioritize, that the value in human systems is often not in the nodes but in the edges, not in the individuals but in the relationships between them. Hoffman's connection to Musk evolved into something that defied easy categorization. He joined the board of the early Tesla Motors and was among the investors in OpenAI, the artificial intelligence research organization that Musk co-founded in 2015, making him a participant in two of the most consequential technology ventures of the following 2 decades. The relationship between them was collegial without being close, marked by mutual respect, and the particular form of understanding that exists between people who have operated at comparable levels of ambition and are therefore capable of taking each other's measure without excessive ceremony. Max Levchin, whose opposition to Musk's technical decisions at X.com and whose participation in the boardroom coup had made him, in Musk's private taxonomy, a complicated figure, went on to build a series of ventures that tracked the arc of his original obsessions: security, data, the mathematics of financial trust. His most prominent later company, Affirm, became one of the defining financial technology platforms of the 2010s, a buy-now-pay-later service that embodied, with considerable irony, precisely the kind of focused, elegant financial product that Levchin had always argued PayPal should have been. He did not build the everything app. He built one thing and built it well. Whether this represented wisdom or limitation, whether Musk's total vision or Levchin's focused execution was ultimately the more valuable orientation, is a question that the evidence continues to resist answering simply. Among the former PayPal employees, whose trajectories would register most visibly in the culture at large, were Steve Chen and Jad Karim, 2 engineers who had worked in the PayPal infrastructure and who carried from that experience both the technical fluency and the entrepreneurial imagination to recognize, in 2005, that the internet had a video problem. The infrastructure for sharing video online was non-existent. The demand for it was not. YouTube, which they co-founded with Chad Hurley, was the answer to that gap, and it was acquired by Google in 2006 for $1.65 billion, a number that would have seemed extraordinary in any era except the one it arrived in, which was the era being built in significant part by the people who had learned to build things in the PayPal offices on University Avenue. The relationship that most rewards examination in the context of this chapter is the one between Musk and Thiel, because it is the one that operates on the most registers simultaneously, and that produces the most in the way of heat and light when held up against the question of what the PayPal era ultimately meant. They were not friends, not in the ordinary sense. They were something more structurally interesting. 2 people who had each been genuinely shaped by their encounter with the other, who had competed and cooperated and clashed and ultimately profited together, and who now circulated in the same ecosystem of capital and ambition with a mutual awareness that was impossible to reduce to either alliance or antagonism. Thiel had removed Musk from the CEO role. Musk had, by most accounts, never entirely forgiven this, and yet forgiveness was perhaps the wrong frame. What Musk had done was understand it, which for him was a more useful operation than forgiveness, and one that yielded more actionable results. Thiel's Founders Fund became an early investor in SpaceX, a fact that requires a moment of reflection. The man who had engineered Musk's removal from his own company subsequently invested in the next company Musk built, not out of sentiment or reconciliation, but out of the cold, precise judgment that SpaceX was likely to succeed, and that the opportunity to participate in that success was worth whatever complicated history had to be set aside to grasp it. Musk, for his part, accepted the investment. Both men were, in this transaction, operating from their deepest natures. Thiel, from the contrarian conviction that the thing most people thought impossible was probably the most valuable bet available. Musk, from the ruthless pragmatism that has always made him more interested in what a relationship can produce than in the feelings it generates. What the PayPal era produced, taken as a whole, was not merely a group of wealthy and well-connected individuals who would go on to fund the next generation of technology. That is the surface description. The deeper truth is that it produced a template, a proof of concept for a specific theory of how exceptional people, given sufficient capital and mutual trust and shared vocabulary, could organize themselves to pursue ambitions that the prevailing institutions had decided were impractical. The PayPal Mafia was not a social club. It was a distributed experiment in what becomes possible when the people who have already built one impossible thing go looking for the next one. Musk understood this perhaps more completely than any of them, because he was the one who had the most at stake in the proof. He had been a co-founder who lost his company. He had been a shareholder who could not protect his position. He had watched men he had hired and men he had competed with organize themselves against him with a precision he had not anticipated, and he had converted that experience into a philosophy of control that was already, as 2002 turned toward 2003, reshaping everything he was building. He had $180 million. He had a network of people who understood what he was capable of. Even if some of them were not certain, it was always a good thing. He had a set of lessons about governance and control, and the relationship between vision and execution that had been purchased at the specific price of being removed from his own creation at 30,000 feet over the Pacific Ocean. And he had, waiting for him in the next chapter of his life, two companies he was preparing to build simultaneously, one pointed at the sky, and one pointed at the future of the automobile, each of which would require him to be not merely ambitious but indestructible, because the obstacles ahead were of a different order of magnitude than anything the PayPal years had managed to produce, and the version of Elon Musk who walked out of the eBay acquisition with his check and his lessons and his furious, undiminished forward momentum was about to discover, in the most visceral terms available, exactly how much of himself he was prepared to spend. Chapter 26. Financial Windfall, the $180 million bet. The spreadsheet was 3 pages long, and it added up to everything he had. Musk sat with it in the way he sat with engineering problems, not casually, not with the performative nonchalance of someone who wants to appear unbothered by large numbers, but with the focused, almost meditative intensity of a man who is doing the specific kind of arithmetic that has consequences on the other side of it. The numbers on the page represented the proceeds from the eBay acquisition, distilled now into a document that was essentially a map of his own future, columns of assets and projected costs, and runway estimates and probability-weighted outcomes that he had been running and rerunning in his head for months before he committed them to paper. $180 million, give or take, after taxes and fees and the ordinary friction of large financial transactions. A number that, to virtually anyone else alive, would have represented the permanent resolution of the question of financial security. To Musk, it represented a budget. He was not, in the autumn of 2002, experiencing any of the emotions that the cultural script for sudden extreme wealth tends to assign to its recipients. There was no visible euphoria, no conspicuous consumption, no extended exhale of a man who has been holding his breath for years and can finally let it go. The people who knew him during this period describe instead a quality of acceleration, the sense that the PayPal exit had not concluded something but enabled something, that the money was fuel of a very specific octane rating, and he had been waiting a very specific amount of time to pour it into the engines he had already designed. He moved through the days following the acquisition with the purposeful urgency of someone who is behind schedule on a project that was supposed to have started already. The project, in fact, had already started. SpaceX had been incorporated in June of 2002, 4 months before the eBay deal closed, founded on a starting investment of $100 million that Musk had committed before the full proceeds of the sale had even cleared, a sequencing detail that reveals something essential about how his mind worked. He had not waited to see the final number. He had not consulted a financial advisor about diversification. He had decided what he was going to do with the money before he fully had it, the way a person who knows exactly where they are going does not wait to arrive before beginning to walk. The world into which Musk was deploying this capital was one that had been organized for the previous 30 years around a set of assumptions about who built rockets and why. The answer to both questions in 2002 was the same. Governments did, and they did it because rocket technology was a strategic asset, a military instrument, a symbol of national capability that existed at the intersection of science and geopolitics and could not be entrusted to the profit motive. NASA had put men on the moon. The Soviet space program had put the first satellite in orbit. The implicit premise of the entire post-war space enterprise was that the stakes were too high and the margins too thin and the expertise too specialized for the market to organize this particular human endeavor. Musk had read the same history and arrived at the opposite conclusion. His argument was not sentimental. It was not organized around the romance of space exploration or the inspirational power of the night sky, though he was capable of invoking both when the audience required it. It was an engineering and economic argument, made with the precision of someone who had spent 2 years studying the aerospace industry with the same systematic thoroughness he had applied to every other domain he had decided to enter. Launch costs were the problem. Everything else, the science, the ambition, the long-term project of making humanity multiplanetary, was downstream of the problem of getting mass out of Earth's gravitational well at a price that did not make the entire enterprise economically absurd. NASA's space shuttle cost approximately $500 million per launch. The Russian Soyuz, which had become the more economical benchmark, cost tens of millions. Both numbers in Musk's analysis were wrong by an order of magnitude. Not wrong in the sense of inaccurate, but wrong in the sense of representing a failure of engineering ambition that had been normalized by decades of institutional inertia and cost-plus government contracting. He believed he could do it for less. He believed this not as a hope, but as a conclusion, derived from first principles calculations about materials and manufacturing, and the fundamental physics of propulsion that he had worked through with the careful rigor of someone who had taught himself orbital mechanics from textbooks and was not burdened by the professional formation that tends to make experts good at refining existing systems and poor at imagining different ones. $100 million into SpaceX. $70 million into Tesla Motors, the electric vehicle company co-founded by Martin Eberhard and Mark Tarpenning, that Musk joined as chairman of the board and lead investor in its Series A round in 2004. A company whose core argument, that electric cars could be desirable rather than merely virtuous, aligned with a theory of market transformation that Musk had been developing since his graduate school days, thinking about the technologies most likely to change the trajectory of civilization. $10 million into SolarCity, the solar energy company that his cousins Lyndon and Peter Rive would found with his encouragement and seed capital, which represented his bet on the third leg of what he was already beginning to articulate as a sustainable energy transition that required not just clean transportation but clean power generation to be meaningful. $180 million deployed. Nearly all of it. Into 3 companies that did not yet have products, in industries, aerospace, automotive, energy, that were among the most capital-intensive, technically demanding, and institutionally resistant to disruption that existed in the American economy. He kept approximately $30 million for living expenses. It was, given the burn rates he was about to experience, barely a rounding error. The specific quality of this decision, its comprehensiveness, its concentration, its absolute refusal of the diversification that every financial advisor in the world would have prescribed as the minimum standard of rational behavior, requires an anecdote to make it fully visible, and fortunately one exists that has been told often enough to have acquired the status of a defining text. In 2007 and 2008, when both SpaceX and Tesla were approaching catastrophic failure simultaneously, when the first 3 Falcon 1 rockets had all failed to reach orbit, and the 4th was the last one the company could afford to attempt, when Tesla was burning through cash faster than it could raise it, and Musk's personal finances had been reduced to borrowing money from friends to cover rent, A journalist asked him in a conversation that he has recounted multiple times whether he had ever thought about keeping the money, about taking a reasonable portion of it and putting it somewhere safe, about the version of his life that would have involved not betting everything. He said he had thought about it. He said the thought had lasted approximately as long as it took him to run the calculation on what the alternative meant, which was a world in which the projects he was working on either did not exist or existed in someone else's hands, and that world was, to him, not a safer world. It was a worse one. The risk he had taken was not, in his own accounting, a financial risk. It was a civilizational one, and framing it as financial was a category error that produced the wrong emotional response to it. The person who was closest to this calculation, who lived inside it in a way that no investor or board member or journalist could, was Justine. The marriage was young, less than 3 years old when the eBay proceeds were deployed, and it was already organized around a center of gravity that was entirely Elon's. Justine was a writer, observant and articulate, and she watched her husband in those years with the dual consciousness of someone who loved him and was also, in some part of herself, documenting him. She saw the excitement with which he approached the deployment of the capital, not the giddy excitement of someone spending money on pleasure, but the taut, forward-leaning excitement of someone executing a plan they have been mentally rehearsing for years. She also saw what it cost, in ways that the spreadsheets did not capture. The $30 million that remained for living expenses, a number that sounds comfortable until measured against the cost of maintaining the household they had established, and the rate at which the companies were consuming capital, was not a cushion. It was a countdown. Justine understood this before Musk acknowledged it, because she was paying attention to different data: the quality of his sleep, which was poor, the frequency with which the dinner table conversation became a product meeting, the way the boundary between home and company, which had never been particularly robust, was dissolving entirely under the pressure of everything he was trying to hold together simultaneously. She was not, by her own account, opposed to the ambition. She had married the ambition in some sense, had recognized it as inseparable from the person, and had made her peace with what it demanded. But there is a difference between accepting the terms of a life and finding those terms sustainable over time, and the early years of the SpaceX and Tesla ventures would test that difference in ways that neither of them had fully modeled when the checks were being written. The financial decision Musk made in 2002 and 2003 was not merely notable for its scale. It was notable for its structure, for what it revealed about the internal hierarchy of values that governed his choices. He had grown up in a household that was not financially stable in the conventional sense, with a father whose relationship to money was complicated, and a childhood in South Africa that had produced, alongside its other formative pressures, a specific understanding that security was not something the external world provided automatically. Most people who arrive at 31 with $180 million and a childhood memory of financial instability invest in security first and ambition second. Musk inverted this. He used the money not to buy safety, but to buy the maximum possible exposure to the outcomes he believed mattered. The psychological mechanism underneath this choice is worth examining carefully, because it is not simply recklessness, though it resembles recklessness from a sufficient distance. It is something more precise, a calibrated willingness to accept personal financial catastrophe as a cost of pursuing objectives that he had concluded were worth that cost. He had run the expected value calculation. He had assigned probabilities to the outcomes. He had determined, with the same rigor he applied to propulsion equations and software architecture, that the bet was worth making. This did not make it comfortable. It made it decided, which is a different thing. The people around him, in those early months of company building, were not always capable of sharing his relationship to the risk. Engineers he hired at SpaceX, who asked about runway, were given answers that were technically accurate and existentially terrifying. Yes, the company had capital, and yes, that capital was finite, and yes, the timeline to the first successful launch was aggressive, and the implication that lived in the space between those three facts was one that most people preferred not to stare at directly. Musk stared at it directly. That was, perhaps, the most important competitive advantage he possessed: not intelligence, not drive, not the technical knowledge he had accumulated across domains, but the specific capacity to look at the worst likely outcome of what he was doing and continued doing it anyway. By the end of 2003, the spreadsheet that had represented his entire fortune had been largely converted into hardware and salaries and lease payments for a factory in El Segundo, California, and a small team of engineers who were trying to build a rocket at a fraction of what the aerospace industry had determined such things cost. Tesla had its Series R investment committed. SolarCity existed as a concept awaiting the right moment for incorporation. The three bets were placed. The wheel was spinning. What Musk could not have fully known, in the specific way that even rigorous probability calculations cannot fully convey the lived experience of the outcomes they model, was that the wheel was about to land on the worst possible configuration, not once, not twice, but 3 consecutive times, and that the person who would be asked to endure that sequence of failures and keep building through them was a man who was simultaneously watching his marriage strain under the weight of everything he had wagered, watching his companies approach the edge of extinction in slow motion, and discovering in the most concrete terms the universe provides exactly what he was made of. The rockets were going to fail. The cars were going to bleed money at a rate that would have broken most people before the first production model rolled off the line. And Musk, standing at the center of it all with his spreadsheet and his first principles and his absolute refusal to consider that he might have been wrong about any of it, was about to enter the most dangerous years of his life, years that would determine not merely whether the companies survived, but whether the man who built them could. Chapter 27. Personal Milestones, Justine Wilson and the First Family. The nursery was painted a pale yellow, the color of something hopeful and not yet tested. It was the kind of detail that lodges itself in memory with a precision that more important things do not always achieve. The specific shade on the wall, the quality of light through the window in the early morning, the arrangement of ordinary objects that will afterward carry the weight of the moment they were present for. Nevada Alexander Musk had been in the world for 10 weeks. He had arrived in the spring of 2002, the first child of a marriage that was itself barely 2 years old, into a household that was simultaneously a home and the forward operating base of one of the most audacious financial gambles in the recent history of American entrepreneurship. He was, by all accounts, healthy. He was, by all accounts, loved with the specific intensity of people who have waited for something and understand at some cellular level that waiting has always been the easy part. On a morning in May, he stopped breathing in his crib. Sudden infant death syndrome offers no mechanism of warning and no logic of causation that can be located and therefore confronted. It simply takes. The medical literature that devastated parents reach for in the aftermath, the studies, the statistics, the risk factors that were either present or absent, provides the comfort of information and almost no comfort of any other kind. The crib had been correct. The room temperature had been correct. Everything that was supposed to have been right had been right. And Nevada was gone, 10 weeks after entering the world, in the particular silence of an ordinary morning that his parents had expected to be ordinary. Justine Musk would write about this loss years later, with the raw and precise honesty of a writer who has decided that the only thing harder than living through something terrible is allowing it to be reduced to euphemism. She described the phone call to the hospital, the arrival of the paramedics who were unable to do what paramedics are called to do, the hours and days that followed in the specific, dissociating unreality of acute grief, a state she characterized as being simultaneously inside your own life and watching it from somewhere outside, unable to fully occupy the present because the present had become intolerable. Elon, she wrote, did not grieve the way she did, which is not to say he did not grieve. He went back to work within days. This is a fact that has been interpreted, in various accounts of this period, through frameworks ranging from pathological avoidance to the specific coping mechanism of a man whose primary mode of emotional processing is action rather than reflection. Both interpretations carry some truth, and neither carries all of it. What seems closer to the whole picture is something more complicated, that Musk experienced loss in the same register in which he experienced most things, not as an invitation to stillness but as a pressure that demanded forward motion, not because the loss was smaller than it should have been but because stillness for him had never been a place where anything resolved. The work was not a flight from Nevada's death. It was the only language Musk had ever fully trusted, and he returned to it the way a person who has been told devastating news in a foreign country reaches for their native tongue. The world of 2002, against which this private catastrophe unfolded, was one that had developed, in the decades since the post-war baby boom, a specific and increasingly elaborate cultural apparatus around the experience of infant loss. SIDS had been named and recognized as a distinct phenomenon only in the early 1970s, and the 30 years since had seen the gradual construction of support networks, grief counseling frameworks, medical research programs, and a social vocabulary that at least attempted to meet bereaved parents with something other than silence and incomprehension. The Back to Sleep campaign, launched in the United States in 1994, had produced a measurable decline in SIDS rates by the time Nevada was born, and yet the decline was statistical, and statistics are cold comfort to the specific family on the wrong side of them. The year 2002 also carried a particular cultural weight around the question of fertility and family formation among the professional class. The generation of which Musk was a part, the early 30-somethings who had deferred parenthood through their 20s in favor of education and career, who had arrived at family formation later than previous generations, and with higher expectations and greater access to medical intervention, was the first generation for whom IVF had been not merely available but normalized as a response to reproductive difficulty. The technology had existed since 1978 and Louise Brown's birth in Lancashire, but it was in the late 1990s and early 2000s that it became genuinely mainstream in American professional culture, discussed openly, pursued routinely, absorbed into the ordinary conversation of people who wanted children and were encountering the various obstacles that wanting does not automatically remove. Musk and Justine turned to IVF after Nevada's death, a decision that carried its own specific weight, not merely the practical choice of a couple who wanted more children and were now, after their loss, understandably unwilling to leave to chance what could be assisted, but also the particular quality that IVF decisions carry when they follow grief. The choice to pursue assisted reproduction after a child's death is not the same choice it is in other contexts. It is freighted with the specific complexity of hope that has already been broken once and is being asked to reconstitute itself around a different mechanism, one that offers better odds but no guarantees, and that requires the couple making it to be simultaneously vulnerable and deliberate in a combination that grief does not naturally facilitate. The core conflict of this chapter is not the practical one, the mechanics of grief and fertility and family formation, but the one that lived inside the marriage, which was increasingly organized around an imbalance that Justine observed and described with a clarity that discomfort has not diminished. She had married Elon Musk knowing at some level what she was marrying. The ambition had been visible from the beginning. At Queen's University, where he had pursued her with the methodical persistence he brought to other problems, and through the Zip2 years and the X.com founding and the PayPal merger and the coup. She had been present for all of it, watching from the particular vantage point of the person who lives with a force rather than being carried by it. She was not a passive figure in this arrangement. Her own writing career, her own intellectual seriousness, her own sense of identity were real and maintained, but she was, in the gravitational physics of the household, the person orbiting the sun rather than the sun itself, and she knew it, and she had made her accommodation with it, and that accommodation was holding with the specific effortful tension of a thing that is being held rather than a thing that is resting naturally. The grief over Nevada strained the accommodation in ways that the business pressures and the financial bets and the physical absences had not, because grief is a demand for presence that ambition cannot easily fulfill. Justine needed something from Elon in the aftermath of their son's death that Elon's architecture did not straightforwardly provide, not because he was indifferent to what had happened, but because his response to what had happened was to move, and her need was to be still with someone in the wreckage, and these two requirements were pulling in opposite directions. There is a moment that Justine has described from the weeks after Nevada's death that functions as a window into the marriage's particular difficulty. She was weeping. This was not unusual in those weeks, was in fact the entirely appropriate response to what had happened, and Elon told her that she should stop. Not with cruelty, not dismissively, but with the specific and genuine conviction of someone who believed that the continued expression of grief was not processing the grief, but extending it, that the appropriate response to loss was to make a decision about how to move forward and begin moving. He was not wrong, that forward motion would eventually be necessary. He was not reading the room in which forward motion was, in that specific moment, precisely the wrong thing. Justine absorbed this. She continued to grieve in the ways she needed to grieve. And she filed the moment away with the careful attention of a writer who understands that the things people reveal under pressure are the truest things they reveal. The twins came first, Griffin and Vivian, born in 2004 through IVF, arriving into a household that had by then been transformed by the simultaneous founding of SpaceX and the early investment in Tesla, a household in which the background noise of world historical ambition had become simply the ambient frequency of daily life. 2 children, healthy and present and requiring the specific, non-negotiable, around-the-clock attention that infants require regardless of what their father is trying to accomplish in the El Segundo factory where rocket engines were being tested. The triplets followed, Kai, Saxon and Damien, born in 2006 also through IVF, arriving into a household that was now, in the most literal sense, a managed emergency. 5 children under 3 years old, 2 companies approaching crises of different kinds, a marriage under pressures that were multiplying faster than either party had fully modeled. The logistics were handled, there was staff, there were resources, there was the infrastructure that significant money makes available, but logistics and presence are not the same thing, and the distinction was one that would matter in ways that were not yet fully visible more with each passing year. The figure who stands at the center of this chapter is Justine herself, and the relationship that requires most careful examination is not the one between Musk and the world, but the one between Musk and the woman who was, through all of this, the person closest to him. Justine Wilson had grown up in Aurora, Ontario, the daughter of a school principal, and she had arrived at adulthood with the specific combination of intellectual ambition and emotional intelligence that tends to produce writers. People who need to understand the world in narrative terms, who process experience by finding its shape and its meaning and articulating them in language that can be shared. She had published a novel before she met Elon. She would publish more. Her writing was not a hobby. It was as constitutive of her identity as building companies was of his, and the marriage, in its fullest form, required both of those identities to coexist in a space that was increasingly organized around only one of them. She loved him. This is not in dispute, and should not be treated as a merely polite preamble to more complicated material. She loved the quality of his mind, the scope of his ambition, the genuine seriousness with which he engaged with the largest questions about where humanity was going and what it would take to get there. She had chosen him, clearly and deliberately, from among the alternatives that a woman of her intelligence and her attractiveness and her own accomplishment could have chosen. The choice had been real, and it had been informed, and its having been real and informed does not mean that its consequences were always what she had expected them to be. What she had not fully modeled, perhaps, what most people who love someone extraordinary fail to fully model, because the full weight of it is only perceptible from the inside, was the specific experience of loving someone whose primary loyalty is to a vision that predates you and will outlast you. Musk was devoted to his children, in the particular, intermittent, intensity when present way that extremely driven people tend to be devoted to their children, capable of complete engagement, and then capable of complete absence, oscillating between the two without always registering the cost of the oscillation on the people who needed the consistency rather than the intensity. He pushed for more children with the same conviction he brought to everything, the belief, not merely sentimental but bordering on philosophical, that having more children was a form of investment in the future he was trying to build, that the people who cared most about civilization's long-term trajectory had an obligation not to leave that trajectory to people who thought about it less. This argument, characteristically, was both genuine and somewhat beside the point in the context of a marriage where the person who would bear and raise the children was a woman with her own vocation and her own exhaustion and her own unmet needs. Nevada Alexander Musk had lived for 10 weeks, and his absence had organized the family that followed him in ways that neither Elon nor Justine could have fully predicted. The IVF decisions, the 5 children who arrived in close succession, the particular intensity with which Musk approached fatherhood when he was present, all of it carried somewhere underneath the surface of ordinary family life, the specific weight of a loss that had been processed differently by each of the 2 people who shared it. The yellow nursery was repainted. The house filled with children and noise, and the organized chaos of a large family being raised in the shadow of an ambition that would not diminish, and would not negotiate, and would not, no matter what else demanded its attention, ever fully come home. What neither Elon nor Justine understood yet, as the triplets arrived and the companies burned through capital, and the marriage bent under pressures it had not been designed to bear, was that the distance between them, the distance that had always been there, that had been managed and accommodated and occasionally mistaken for the natural shape of the thing, was not stable. It was growing, incrementally, in the way that distances grow when two people are moving in directions that are not quite parallel, and the divergence is small enough to be invisible in any given week, but large enough over years to open into something that cannot be closed by love alone. The rockets were about to begin their terrible sequence of failures, and the man who had bet everything on them was about to discover that the losses accumulating in his professional life and the losses accumulating in his personal one were not separate accounts. They were drawing from the same reserve, and the reserve, for the first time in his adult life, was running genuinely low. Chapter 28. The Russian ICBM Negotiation. A Strategic Rude Awakening. The Russian spat on the floor. It was not an accident, and it was not a nervous habit. It was a communication, precise, deliberate, and targeted at the young American sitting across the table in a Moscow conference room in the winter of 2001, who had arrived with a spreadsheet, a vision, and the specific unearned confidence of someone who had made a great deal of money in software and had not yet encountered an industry that found this unimpressive. The Russian, one of the rocket engineers or officials present at the meeting, depending on which account one reads, the details varying slightly across the recollections of the people who were there, looked at Musk with an expression that those present describe as a compound of contempt and amusement in roughly equal measure. He said in Russian that was translated for Musk's benefit, some version of the sentiment that they were not interested in selling their rockets to a man who could not demonstrate he knew what rockets were for. Musk absorbed this. He did not respond with anger, did not rise from his chair, did not perform the wounded dignity of someone who expects the world to recognize their credentials on arrival. He sat with it in the specific way he sat with information that contradicted his prior model, processing it, categorizing it, and filing it in the part of his mind that was already beginning, even then, to ask a different question than the one he had come to Moscow to answer. He had come to buy a rocket. He was leaving with something more valuable. The trip had begun, as several of Musk's most consequential decisions began, with a book. He had been reading voraciously in the late 1990s about space exploration, not the popular science versions, though he consumed those too, but the technical literature, the mission reports, the engineering histories of the programs that had put satellites in orbit and men on the moon and probes at the edges of the solar system. The reading had produced, alongside its technical education, a growing alarm about trajectory. NASA's budget had been declining in real terms since the Apollo era. The space shuttle, which had been sold to Congress in the 1970s as a low-cost, high-frequency access to orbit system, had delivered neither low-cost nor high-frequency, and the Challenger disaster of 1986 had added a dimension of institutional trauma that the agency was still navigating 15 years later. The American public, Musk had concluded from polls and news coverage, and the simple evidence of what people talked about, had lost the plot, had been allowed to lose it, by a generation of political and institutional decisions that had treated space as a legacy program rather than a living priority. His response to this diagnosis had been characteristically unorthodox. He had conceived of what he called the Mars Oasis, a project to send a small greenhouse to the surface of Mars, grow a plant in Martian soil, and broadcast the images back to Earth. It was not, on its face, a technical project. It was a public relations project, a calculated attempt to rekindle the sense of possibility and wonder that he believed had been the real engine of public support for space exploration during the Apollo era. Show people something alive on another planet, Musk reasoned, and the argument for prioritizing that planet in the national imagination would make itself. The greenhouse was the Trojan horse. The real payload was inspiration. To deliver a greenhouse to Mars, he needed a rocket. To acquire a rocket without founding an aerospace company, which was not yet his plan, or not yet consciously his plan, the most economical available option appeared to be the former Soviet Union, which had, in the decade following the Cold War's end, developed the specific entrepreneurial flexibility that comes from having enormous stockpiles of military hardware and dramatically reduced budgets for maintaining it. Decommissioned ICBMs were, in the informal economy of post-Soviet aerospace, a product in search of buyers, and Musk, who had done the math on his available capital and the projected cost of a Mars mission, believed he was positioned to be one. The world into which he carried this idea in the winter of 2001 was one organized around a set of geopolitical and cultural tensions that made the image of a 30-year-old American internet millionaire arriving in Moscow to purchase ballistic missiles simultaneously absurd and, in its specific way, perfectly legible as a product of its moment. The post-Cold War relationship between the United States and Russia in 2001 was in one of its periodically warmer phases. George W. Bush had looked into Vladimir Putin's eyes at their first summit in June of that year and offered his famous assessment of the man's soul, and the diplomatic temperature, while never uncomplicated, was at least negotiable. The September 11th attacks, which occurred between Musk's first and second trips to Moscow, had produced a brief intensification of U.S.-Russia cooperation in the context of the broader counterterrorism framework, creating an environment in which certain transactions that might otherwise have encountered institutional resistance were proceeding with unusual fluidity. American capital and Russian hardware had been conducting a series of awkward courtships throughout the 1990s. Boeing and Lockheed had formed a joint venture with Russian and Ukrainian rocket manufacturers called International Launch Services, and the Mir space station had hosted American astronauts under a cooperation agreement that would have seemed fantastical to anyone who had lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. Into this complex but navigable landscape, Musk arrived with Jim Cantrell, an aerospace consultant who had been working in the post-Soviet space industry and who had connected with Musk through the network of space enthusiasts who had been orbiting the Mars Society and related organizations. Cantrell was the practical anchor, the person who understood Russian aerospace culture, who had the relationships, who could translate not merely the language but the institutional psychology of an industry that had spent 50 years operating under fundamentally different assumptions about what rockets were for and who got to have them. The first trip, in late 2001, went poorly. The second trip, in early 2002, went worse. The meetings took place in conference rooms and offices that had the specific aesthetic of Russian institutional space from the period: heavy furniture, fluorescent light, the particular atmosphere of organizations that had once been at the absolute center of global technological competition, and were now conducting that competition in a diminished register, with reduced budgets and complicated feelings about the Americans who kept arriving to buy things. The engineers and officials Musk met with were not, in the main, dismissive because they were unsophisticated. They were dismissive because they were experienced, and their experience had given them a finely calibrated instrument for detecting the difference between a serious aerospace customer and a wealthy enthusiast who had read the right books and mistaken comprehension for expertise. Musk was presenting as the latter. He arrived with his numbers, his projections, his carefully constructed argument for why the Mars Oasis mission was technically feasible and commercially rational. He was fluent in the material, genuinely impressively fluent, and his fluency was precisely the problem. The Russians had spent careers in this industry. They had built the rockets. They had designed the guidance systems and the propulsion stages, and the thermal protection and the 1,000 other systems that Musk was treating as line items in a spreadsheet. His fluency, to them, was the fluency of a man who has read extensively about surgery and arrives at the hospital with a scalpel. The price they quoted him, when they quoted one at all, was $8 million per rocket. It was presented not as an opening position in a negotiation, but as a statement of what his interest was worth to them, which was to say not very much. When Musk pushed back, when he deployed the argument that the cost should be lower given the available supply and the decommissioned status of the hardware, the response was the one that Cantrell and others who were present have described consistently: dismissal, sometimes polite, sometimes not, and in at least one memorable instance accompanied by the expectoration that announced with the directness that Russian engineers apparently sometimes prefer to diplomacy that the conversation was over. What happened on the flight home from Moscow is one of those moments that biographers are drawn to, not because it is dramatic in the conventional sense, but because it is generative, because it is the moment from which everything that follows is, in some meaningful way, descended. Cantrell was sitting next to Musk on the plane. Musk had been quiet for some time, which Cantrell had learned to recognize as a sign not of dejection but of computation, the processing state that preceded a conclusion. Then Musk opened his laptop and began building a spreadsheet. Not a reaction to what had happened, not a record of the failed negotiation, but something else, a cost analysis of the components required to build a rocket from scratch. Raw materials, manufacturing processes, engine design, structural requirements, the physics of launch, broken down into its constituent costs and arrayed against the numbers the Russians had quoted him. Cantrell watched over his shoulder as the spreadsheet grew. He has described the experience in terms that carry the specific quality of witnessing something that is only fully understood in retrospect. The sense that he was watching a man arrive at a conclusion that was going to matter without yet being able to see exactly how much. The conclusion, when Musk articulated it, was simple in its statement and staggering in its implications. The Russians were charging $8 million for a rocket that the underlying materials and manufacturing processes, properly organized and ruthlessly optimized, should cost perhaps a tenth of that. The aerospace industry had been operating for decades under a cost structure that was not a reflection of engineering necessity, but of institutional inertia. The accumulated overhead of government contracting, the cost-plus incentive structure that rewarded spending rather than efficiency, the absence of competitive pressure in a market where the customers were largely governments, and the primary metric of success was not cost but reliability and national prestige. If you built a rocket company organized around different incentives, around the principle that the cost of reaching orbit should be driven toward its actual physical minimum rather than its historical bureaucratic average, you could undercut every existing launch provider in the world while still operating profitably. You did not need to buy a Russian ICBM. You needed to build your own rocket, and you needed to build it the way software was built, iteratively, efficiently, with a relentless focus on eliminating waste at every stage of the process. The figure who accompanied Musk through both Moscow trips and who stands as this chapter's pivotal supporting presence is Cantrell, and the relationship between them illuminates something important about how Musk operates when he is genuinely learning something rather than merely executing a plan he has already formed. Cantrell was older than Musk, more experienced in the specific domain, and possessed of the skeptic's instinct that comes from years spent watching ambitious outsiders arrive in aerospace with their spreadsheets and their certainty, and their insufficient respect for the gap between understanding a system intellectually and being capable of building it. He had agreed to accompany Musk to Moscow with a mixture of genuine interest and professional caution, uncertain whether he was dealing with someone who would convert his enthusiasm into something real or someone who would discover, at contact with the actual industry, that the gap was larger than his spreadsheet had accounted for. What he witnessed on the flight home began to answer that question. Musk was not discouraged. He was redirected. And the redirection was not a retreat from the ambition but an escalation of it. He had gone to Moscow to buy a rocket, and had come home with the conviction that he should build a rocket company, which was an outcome so far beyond what the trip had been intended to produce that it strained credulity, except that Musk's history was already establishing a pattern in which the obstacle, reliably and almost without exception, became the path. Cantrell would become one of the early employees of SpaceX, bringing his aerospace expertise into the service of an enterprise that he had watched be conceived in real time at 30,000 feet over the Atlantic. He would not stay forever. The specific intensity of Musk's leadership style and the demands it placed on everyone in proximity to it were not indefinitely sustainable for most people, and Cantrell would eventually depart, as many early SpaceX employees would depart, with a complicated mixture of pride in what they had built and relief at the distance. But in the founding period, his expertise and his networks were among the critical inputs that made the thing possible. The spreadsheet that Musk built on that return flight from Moscow was not, in any final sense, the business plan of SpaceX. It was something more primitive and more important. It was the moment at which the question changed. He had arrived in Russia, asking where he could buy a rocket. He was returning to America asking why rockets cost what they cost, and what it would take to build one that cost less. The second question was the one that, properly answered, would produce a company, and the company would produce a rocket. And the rocket, after failures that would have ended any ordinary enterprise, and that would very nearly end this one, would eventually produce something that no private individual had ever produced before. He did not know, on that plane, how close to the edge those failures would bring him, how many times the vehicle would explode, how many times the money would approach zero, how many times the people who had decided he was a dilettante would appear to be correct. He knew only that the Russians had shown him a door by slamming one in his face, and that on the other side of it was something large enough to justify everything he was about to spend to get there. The incorporated entity would come next. The engineers would follow, and the particular punishing education that awaited anyone who tried to do what no private citizen had ever done would begin in earnest. But the first lesson, the one that made all the subsequent lessons possible, had been delivered in a Moscow conference room by a man who spat on the floor, and Musk characteristically had learned it completely. Chapter 29. Founding SpaceX, the El Segundo startup. The warehouse smelled like machine oil and ambition, which in El Segundo in the spring of 2002 were essentially the same smell. It sat on East Grand Avenue, a squat industrial building of the kind that Southern California generates in abundance along its commercial corridors, unremarkable from the street, indistinguishable from its neighbors, possessed of none of the architectural vocabulary that announces itself as the site of something consequential. The loading dock faced a parking lot. The ceiling was high and unfinished, crossed by conduit and ductwork that had been installed for purposes having nothing to do with rocket propulsion. The floors were concrete, the kind that absorbs oil and reflects fluorescent light with equal impartiality. It was, by any reasonable measure, a building designed to house things rather than to build them. Inventory, perhaps, or automotive parts, or the overflow stock of one of the light manufacturing operations that populated the industrial neighborhoods between Los Angeles International Airport and the Pacific Coast. Elon Musk walked through it with the expression of a man who was not seeing what was there, but what was going to be there. And the distance between those two things was, by the estimation of everyone who accompanied him on the walk through, approximately the distance between a reasonable ambition and an insane one. He signed the lease. Space Exploration Technologies Corporation had been incorporated on March 14, 2002, in the specific businesslike manner that Musk had by now refined across two previous companies. Not with ceremony, not with the kind of founding mythology that startups sometimes construct retrospectively to give their origins the weight they have since acquired, but with the focused practicality of someone who understood that incorporation was a legal necessity and that the actual founding of a company happened in the hiring and the building and the daily decisions that turned a document into an organism. The name was deliberate in its ambition and slightly awkward in its grandiosity, which may be why almost no one used it. From the beginning, it was SpaceX, a compression that carried both the exploratory aspiration and the entrepreneurial urgency, two syllables that moved faster than four words. The $100 million Musk had committed to the enterprise was, by the standards of aerospace, a rounding error. Lockheed Martin's annual revenue was measured in the tens of billions. Boeing's Space and Defense Division operated at a scale that made SpaceX's founding capital look like what it was: the personal fortune of a 30-year-old internet entrepreneur who had decided on a plane ride home from Moscow that the rocket industry was broken in a way that he could fix. The incumbents, when they noticed SpaceX at all in those early months, noticed it with the specific, unhurried condescension of institutions that have survived many challengers and have learned to distinguish the ones worth taking seriously from the ones that will exhaust themselves against the wall of what the industry actually requires. The year 2002 was a year in which the American aerospace industry was organized around certainties that had accumulated over 5 decades of government-funded development, and that had the quality, as all accumulated certainties do, of appearing to be natural laws rather than historical contingencies. Launch costs were what they were because that was what launches cost. Development timelines were what they were because that was how long development took. The workforce required to build a rocket was the workforce it had always required: thousands of specialized contractors, organized in the hierarchical structures of cost-plus government contracts, producing hardware through processes that had been certified and recertified across generations of engineers, until the certification had become, in some cases, more important than the hardware itself. Musk's founding premise was that all of this was wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong at the margins in ways that incremental improvement might address, but systematically, structurally wrong in a way that required not reform but replacement. He had done the first principles calculation on the plane from Moscow, and he had done it again in the weeks that followed, checking his numbers against the technical literature and the material science and the physics that did not negotiate, and the conclusion had held. The cost of the raw materials required to build a rocket was approximately 2% of the price that the aerospace industry charged for the finished product. The gap between 2% and 100% was not engineering. It was overhead. The accumulated cost of institutional inertia, bureaucratic process, risk-averse contracting structures, and the absence of any meaningful competitive pressure on an industry whose primary customer had for most of its history been a government with a geopolitical imperative rather than a budget constraint. He was going to close that gap. The El Segundo warehouse was where he was going to start. The first and most critical hire, the one that determined whether SpaceX was a company or a very expensive thought experiment, was Tom Mueller. And the story of how Mueller came to be SpaceX's first propulsion engineer is one of those founding narratives that has acquired, through repeated telling, the quality of legend while remaining at its core essentially true. Mueller had grown up in rural Idaho, the son of a logger, in a household where the nearest town was small and the nearest city was far, and the primary entertainment available to a mechanically curious boy was taking things apart and attempting to put them back together in configurations that worked better than the originals. He had taught himself to build rocket engines as a hobby, not the model rocketry of a casual enthusiast, but serious liquid propellant engines designed from engineering principles and tested in the Mojave Desert on his own time and with his own money, with a sophistication that professional aerospace engineers who encountered his work found genuinely startling. He had a day job at TRW, one of the major aerospace contractors, where he worked on propulsion systems for government satellite programs with the competence of someone who understood the work deeply and the patience of someone who was doing it at a pace set by institutional process rather than personal capability. Musk had been introduced to Mueller through the web of space enthusiasts and amateur rocketry organizations that had connected him, in the period before the Moscow trips, to the community of people who cared about this problem. The introduction had led to a visit to Mueller's garage in the hills above Los Angeles, where Mueller had built and tested a liquid propellant engine that was producing, by the time Musk arrived, roughly 13,000 pounds of thrust, an output that no hobbyist had any business achieving in a residential garage, and that Musk, who had been doing the math on what a small orbital rocket required, recognized immediately as the proof of concept he needed. The meeting in Mueller's garage has been described by both men in interviews over the years, and what both accounts emphasize, in different registers, is the speed with which Musk moved from assessment to offer. He examined the engine. He asked Mueller questions, technical questions, specific questions, the kind that revealed whether the questioner understood the answers rather than merely the asking of them. Mueller answered, and in answering discovered that Musk's preparation was more rigorous than he had expected, that the man standing in his garage had clearly spent serious time with the engineering literature and was not performing comprehension but actually possessing it. Then Musk offered him the job of building the propulsion system for a new private rocket company that would compete with Boeing and Lockheed Martin on launch costs, and that was funded primarily by Musk's own money, which he intended to deploy completely if the mission required it. Mueller asked how much it would cost to build the engine. Musk quoted a number. Mueller, who had spent his career in an industry where the number would have had several more digits, looked at him for a moment and said something to the effect that it was not enough. Musk said it was what they had, and that the job was to figure out how to build the engine for what they had, rather than to determine that what they had was insufficient. Mueller took the job. It was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential employment decisions in the history of private spaceflight, not because Mueller was the only person capable of building the engine, but because his combination of genuine technical mastery, practical frugality born of years of self-funded work, and willingness to operate outside the cost structures of the established industry made him the specific person that SpaceX needed at the specific moment it needed someone. He became employee number one in the operational sense, the person around whom the technical team was built, the engineering anchor that gave the enterprise its credibility with the subsequent hires who needed to believe that the propulsion problem was being handled by someone who actually knew what they were doing. The hiring that followed Mueller established a pattern that would define SpaceX's culture for its entire early period. Musk was recruiting from the aerospace industry, but he was not recruiting the aerospace industry's typical products. He wanted engineers who had been frustrated by the pace and the process of the institutional programs, people who knew the work deeply and had been performing it at a fraction of their potential velocity because the organizations around them had been optimized for something other than speed. He wanted people who had built things with their own hands, who understood the difference between a specification and a reality, who had the specific kind of intelligence that is not merely analytical but physical, the ability to hold in mind simultaneously the equations that describe a system and the metal that has to embody it. He was also, characteristically, unwilling to pay the salaries that the aerospace industry offered for equivalent experience, compensating instead with equity in a company that was, by any standard actuarial assessment, likely to fail. The people who took those offers were, by definition, self-selecting for a particular combination of confidence in Musk's vision and tolerance for risk that the enterprise required, and that a more conventional compensation structure would not have filtered for. SpaceX's early workforce was not merely talented. It was, by construction, constituted of people who had made a bet, and the shared experience of having made the same bet in the same direction created a cohesion that the warehouse on East Grand Avenue required, because the alternative to cohesion, given what they were attempting, was dissolution. Musk's own presence in the building was total, in the way that his presence had been total at Zip2 and X.com, with the added intensity of a man who had learned from two previous experiences that the distance between the founder's understanding and the product's quality was a distance he could not afford. He was not a passive investor reviewing progress reports. He was in the warehouse, at the workbenches, in the meetings where propulsion parameters were being debated and structural designs were being evaluated, and manufacturing processes were being invented from scratch because the processes the aerospace industry used were too slow and too expensive and too dependent on supply chains that had been built for government programs rather than startup economics. He asked questions constantly, not the questions of a generalist seeking orientation, but the questions of someone who had done the reading and wanted to test the boundary between what he understood and what he did not. Engineers who were accustomed to the deference that technical expertise typically commands in professional settings discovered that Musk's deference had a limit, and the limit was not their credentials but their arguments. If you could explain why something had to be done a certain way, in terms that survived first principle scrutiny, he would accept it. If your explanation was, "That's how it's done in the industry," you had given him information about the industry rather than about the problem, and he would proceed to treat the problem as open. This was exhilarating for some people and exhausting for others, and the ones who found it exhausting tended not to last, which meant that the organization that emerged from the early hiring and the early departures was one that had been, through a process of considerable friction, shaped to Musk's specific tolerances. It was not a comfortable organization. It was a fast one, which in the rocket business, where the competitors had a 50-year head start and the physics were unforgiving, was the only kind worth being. By the end of 2002, the warehouse on East Grand Avenue housed a growing team of engineers attacking the design of what would become the Falcon 1, a two-stage liquid-fueled rocket with a Merlin engine in its first stage and a Kestrel in its second, designed to carry small payloads to low Earth orbit at a price that the existing launch market would find, if the numbers held, essentially impossible to compete with. The design was not finished. The engine was not built. The launch site did not exist. The regulatory approvals had not been obtained. The supply chain had not been established. The list of things that had not yet been done was, by any conventional aerospace project management assessment, the list of a program that would take a decade and a budget several orders of magnitude larger than the one available. Musk intended to do it in 2 years. The gap between his timeline and the timeline that the work actually required was not, as some of the engineers who lived through it would later observe, the result of naivety. It was a strategy, the deliberate imposition of a schedule that was impossible by the industry's standards, because the industry's standards had been built by people who were not trying to prove that the industry's standards were wrong, and Musk was. The pressure of the impossible schedule did not always produce the intended results. It produced, alongside genuine breakthroughs in manufacturing efficiency and engineering creativity, a rate of turnover, and a level of sustained stress that would become, in the years ahead, one of SpaceX's defining characteristics. The cost of moving at a speed the industry had decided was unavailable. What no one in the El Segundo warehouse could see yet, in those early months of drafting tables and whiteboard equations, and the foundational arguments about how to build an engine for a fraction of what TRW and Rocketdyne charged, was that the first rocket they built would fail, and the second would fail, and the third would fail, and that each failure would consume not merely money but something harder to replenish, and that the man who had funded the enterprise with his own fortune and his own conviction would be forced, before the first success arrived, to look directly at the possibility that the calculation he had made on the plane from Moscow had been wrong in the most final and expensive way available. The warehouse was full of brilliant people building something that had never been built this way before, and the thing they could not yet know was that brilliant people building unprecedented things in warehouses with insufficient budgets and impossible schedules are not protected by their brilliance or their budget or their schedule from the specific democratic cruelty of the rocket equation, which does not negotiate and does not grade on a curve and does not care in the slightest how much you have already spent. Chapter 30. The First Principles of Aerospace. The whiteboard was covered in numbers that should not have been possible. Not impossible in the way that science fiction is impossible, not violating any physical law or mathematical principle, but impossible in the specific, institutional sense that the people who built rockets for a living had decided, through the accumulated evidence of 50 years of doing it, that these were not the numbers the industry produced. Cost per kilogram to low Earth orbit. Material costs as a percentage of final vehicle price. Manufacturing overhead ratios. Margins on launch contracts. The arithmetic was laid out in Musk's handwriting, which was neither elegant nor careless but purely functional, the script of someone who uses written language as a tool for thinking rather than as a form of expression. And it told a story that the established aerospace industry would have found, had anyone thought to show it to them in the spring of 2002, somewhere between naive and offensive. Musk stood at the whiteboard with the focused stillness of someone who has been working on the same problem for long enough, that the problem has stopped feeling like a problem, and started feeling like a landscape, something he inhabited rather than merely contemplated. He had been running these numbers in various configurations for months. The conclusion was always the same. The conclusion was the whole point. He capped the marker and looked at what he had written. The story of how Elon Musk came to build rockets is, at its deepest level, not a story about rockets. It is a story about a method, a way of approaching any problem that strips it of its historical context and its institutional assumptions and its accumulated conventional wisdom, and asks, with the specific ruthlessness of someone who does not consider precedent to be evidence, what the thing actually requires versus what the system has decided it costs. The method had a name, borrowed from Aristotle by way of physics education, first principles reasoning. The idea was ancient and the application was radical, and in the aerospace industry of 2002, it was, in the most precise sense available, revolutionary. The world that SpaceX entered in its founding year was one in which the cost of reaching orbit had become, over the previous 5 decades, a number so large and so stable that the industry had stopped treating it as a variable. The Ariane 5, the dominant commercial launch vehicle in the Western market, cost approximately $150 million per flight. The Delta IV, Boeing's heavy-lift vehicle, was more expensive still. Even the Russian Soyuz, the budget option for a market that had learned to think of budget as a relative term, cost tens of millions per launch. These were not prices in the competitive market sense. They were not the result of suppliers bidding against each other for customers with alternatives. They were prices in the monopoly sense, set by organizations that had no meaningful competitors and that had built their cost structures over generations of cost-plus government contracting, in which the incentive was not to reduce expense but to justify it. The incentive structure mattered enormously, and Musk had studied it with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to every domain he entered. Cost-plus contracting, the dominant model for government aerospace procurement, paid contractors their costs plus an agreed profit margin. The practical consequence of this model was that efficiency was not rewarded, and inefficiency was not punished. A contractor who found a way to manufacture a component for half the previous cost did not thereby earn a larger margin. He earned the same margin on a smaller base. The rational response, which the industry had been enacting for decades without always acknowledging it explicitly, was to not find the cheaper way. The system had been designed, for entirely understandable reasons rooted in the specific demands of Cold War-era military procurement, to ensure quality and reliability at any cost, and it had succeeded magnificently at that objective, and only at that objective. Musk was not interested in that objective. He was interested in a different one: access to orbit at a price that made the long-term goal of a spacefaring civilization economically conceivable rather than economically preposterous. These were not the same objective, and the infrastructure built to serve the first one was actively hostile to the second. The first principles analysis began with aluminum, then carbon fiber, then the specific alloys required for rocket engine combustion chambers, then the electronics, the guidance systems, the structural components, the propellant, the ground support equipment. Every element of a launch vehicle decomposed into its material constituents and priced at the commodity level rather than the contracted manufacturing level. The exercise was not sophisticated in its mathematics. It was sophisticated in its premise: the willingness to ask what something actually costs to make, rather than accepting what the market charges for it, and to treat the gap between those two numbers as an engineering problem rather than a natural condition. The gap, when Musk calculated it, was staggering. The raw materials required to build a rocket represented, by his analysis, approximately 2 to 3% of the price that the aerospace industry charged for the finished vehicle. The remaining 97% was everything else: labor, overhead, profit margin, the cost of the regulatory compliance apparatus, the expense of the supply chains that had been built to serve government programs with government timelines and government budgets, and the compounded inefficiency of organizations that had been optimizing for something other than cost reduction for their entire institutional lives. This was not fraud. It was not conspiracy. It was the entirely predictable output of a system that had been designed to achieve specific objectives under specific constraints, and that had succeeded, and that had in its success created a structure so entrenched and so self-reinforcing that the people inside it had largely stopped being able to see it from the outside. Musk could see it from the outside because he had never been inside it, and this, paradoxically, was his primary competitive advantage in an industry where experience was otherwise everything. He did not know what was impossible, because he had not yet been taught. He knew only what the physics permitted, and what the materials cost, and what the gap between those numbers and the industry's prices implied about the opportunity available to anyone willing to close it. The method he intended to use to close it had a name too, drawn from manufacturing rather than philosophy: vertical integration. The conventional aerospace supply chain was horizontal in its architecture, a prime contractor at the top, assembling components sourced from dozens or hundreds of specialized suppliers, each of which had its own overhead and its own margin, and its own institutional processes and its own lead times. Boeing did not make its own fasteners. Lockheed did not make its own avionics. The specialization was rational in a world where the volume of production was high enough to justify the development of specialist suppliers, but in the world of launch vehicles, where production volumes were measured in the single digits annually, it produced a supply chain that was simultaneously expensive, slow, and fragile, dependent on suppliers whose primary customers were often other government programs and who therefore operated on government timelines. SpaceX would make as much of the rocket as it possibly could in-house. Engines, airframe structures, avionics, software, launch infrastructure. The goal was to bring as much of the manufacturing stack as possible within the walls of the El Segundo warehouse. Not because in-house manufacturing was inherently superior in every case, but because the specific failure mode of the horizontal supply chain, the single supplier who is behind schedule, the component that costs 3 times what the commodity analysis says it should, the margin that gets taken at every tier of the stack, was incompatible with the cost target that made the whole enterprise meaningful. There is a specific episode from the early SpaceX period that illuminates this principle with the clarity that a single concrete example sometimes provides better than any amount of abstract analysis. The company needed flight computer hardware, the electronics that would guide the rocket during ascent. The standard aerospace procurement path would have led to a specialized avionics supplier, a long qualification process, a unit cost in the range of $50,000 to $100,000 per system, and a delivery timeline measured in months. Musk's engineers, applying the first principles framework, asked a different question. What did the flight computer actually need to do? And what was the simplest, cheapest hardware capable of doing it? The answer led them to a solution assembled primarily from commercial off-the-shelf components, electronics developed for consumer or industrial applications, available at a fraction of the aerospace qualified price, and perfectly capable of performing the required functions if properly integrated and tested. The qualification process was harder. The engineering work was more demanding, because the team was solving a problem that the standard procurement path would have outsourced to a specialist. The result was a flight computer that cost a fraction of what the conventional approach would have produced, and that performed its function as reliably as the more expensive alternative. This was the first principles method applied to hardware, and it worked the same way every time Musk's engineers applied it. Ask what the thing needs to do. Identify the cheapest capable solution, do the engineering work to make the cheap solution work, and resist the institutional pressure to default to the expensive solution because the expensive solution comes with documentation that says it worked last time. The man who was doing more than anyone else to translate this philosophy into actual hardware was Tom Muller, and the relationship between Musk and Muller in this period is one of the more instructive examples of how Musk's method worked in practice, not as a theory imposed from above, but as a dialogue between a framework and an expertise, each sharpening the other. Muller had spent his career at TRW building engines under the cost-plus contracting model, and he understood from the inside exactly the inefficiencies that Musk's first principles analysis was identifying from the outside. He had watched components get priced at multiples of their actual cost because the pricing was done by procurement systems optimized for government contracts rather than manufacturing reality. He had worked around institutional processes that added months to development timelines without adding commensurate value. He had, in his garage, with his own hands and his own money, demonstrated that a capable liquid propellant engine could be built for a small fraction of what TRW charged for equivalent performance. When Musk pushed him, in the early design sessions for the Merlin engine, to justify every cost and every timeline with first principles rather than with the precedents of previous programs, Muller pushed back, not because he disagreed with the framework, but because he understood, in the way that people who have built real hardware understand, that first principles analysis could identify the theoretical minimum cost of a system, but could not always account for the practical obstacles between theory and metal. The dialogue between them, between Musk's relentless pressure toward the theoretical minimum and Mueller's hard-won knowledge of where the practical obstacles lived, was the engine of SpaceX's early engineering culture, and it produced something that neither man would have produced alone. Musk drove. Muller built. The whiteboard numbers descended, over months of argument and iteration, into hardware. The Falcon 1 that emerged from this process was, in its design philosophy, a direct expression of the first principles framework. It was a small rocket, designed to carry payloads of around 600 kilograms to low Earth orbit. Not because small rockets were inherently better than large ones, but because the first principles analysis of the market identified a gap specifically at the small end, where existing launch vehicles were either too expensive for their payload class or unavailable entirely. It was a two-stage vehicle using liquid oxygen and rocket-grade kerosene, propellants chosen not for their theoretical performance characteristics but for their availability, their handling properties, and their cost. The Merlin engine that Muller was designing for the first stage was targeting a cost that aerospace veterans found implausible and that Musk treated as a requirement. The target was not met on the first attempt. It was not met on the second. The first principles framework, which was brilliant as a method for identifying where the cost should be, did not automatically resolve the gap between where the cost should be and where it actually was when you were building something for the first time, with a team that had never built it before, on a schedule that assumed a learning curve steeper than any previous rocket program had achieved. This was the place where the first principles philosophy encountered its limit. Not the limit of its logic, which was sound, but the limit of its completeness. Musk's analysis told him what the rocket should cost. It did not tell him how many times it would explode before it flew, and the cost of those explosions, financial, temporal, psychological, was a variable that the whiteboard numbers had not adequately captured. The warehouse on East Grand Avenue was full of people who believed in the numbers, and the numbers were right. And the believing would be tested in the years ahead by a sequence of failures that no first principles analysis had predicted. And that would bring the enterprise to the edge of the thing that no equation describes. The point at which even correct reasoning, sustained at enormous personal cost against overwhelming institutional skepticism, has to reckon with the possibility that being right in theory and succeeding in practice are, not in the rocket business, the same thing.